artists who wish to use their work to change the world, to exhibit and to share. And the current exhibit is from a collective that's based partially in Maine, but I believe is scattered around the country. So please enjoy it, and there's brochures about other events here, as well as upcoming exhibits. So it's a great place. I encourage you to come back here for other events. In terms of the Peace Council, we are the oldest local peace and social justice organization in the country. Celebrated our 75th anniversary last year. And we had an amazing year of different events, and there's one piece of that 75th year celebration which is about to be completed, which is the CD release party for this project that we started that we initially thought would come out during the 75th year. But those of you who've worked on big projects know that sometimes they don't follow the time frame that we like. So this is the Peace Song CNY CD, and one of the featured artists, Jock Kofi, happens to be here with us. He didn't bring his guitar. We might try to get him up here to do a preview for you. But the release party is this coming Sunday from 5 to 9 p.m. at the Metro Lounge on Westcott Street. There's little handbills for it and flyers if you want to take some. We'd welcome you to join us for that. The Peace Council also is always looking for people to become involved in our work. We recognize that changing the world is a big task, and that we need all of us on board to do that effectively. This is a copy of our most recent newsletter, and on the back of it is a calendar of events of the Peace Councils and other community events related to peace and social justice. A couple of things I'd highlight. One is that we have our spring activist orientation coming up next Wednesday, a week from tomorrow night, from 6 to 7:30, and would welcome you to come for that. And if you want to stick around immediately afterwards, it's a busy night for us at the office, is that our radical reading group is beginning to read a book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, about racism in the criminal justice system. I haven't read it, but it's supposed to be a very powerful book. So we welcome you for either of those. There's more information about Peace Council activities and events over there, including a sign-up sheet. I don't want to talk a great deal in terms of introducing Dr. Mugo, but I was thinking about a book that I read with my son, who's very into history, a couple of years ago. That's part of a series, and in it, it's these two children who time travel, and they're back in the Civil War, and they meet this African-American man who is he's fighting for the Union, and he's badly injured, and this boy is trying to figure out what he might say to try and comfort him. He says, you know, you're a brave freedom fighter, and that's what I think about Dr. Mugo. I think she's a brave freedom fighter who has taken risks, who has spoken out boldly for what she believes in, and has suffered for that. And the other little vignette I would share is several years ago, Syracuse University had this big high-profile program related to peace. And being Syracuse University, they had some local people like Dr. Mugo, but then invited in these people like Richard Holbrooke, and they had William Safire on videotape. And Dr. Mugo so impressed me by sort of just cutting to the quick and naming the lies and the distortions that feed U.S. policy. And after it was over, I saw Richard Holbrooke, who was intimately involved in many of these aggressive imperial policies, sort of make a beeline and sort of try to talk with you. And I wasn't privy to the conversation, but I thought, this is really what there needs to be more of. People like that having to face criticism from thoughtful, creative people who challenge them. So I look forward, along with you, to being challenged tonight by Dr. Mugo's reflections and words. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that very warm, comradely introduction. Let me ask if you would be kind enough to just pass these around. You might have to share them, and I will explain why I am passing them around. But
These are prepaid on the New World one.
I do want to
I pay my bills online,
apologize
shop.
for the state in which I appear to you today. I had a long trip that then that took me to Tanzania, Kenya, and so on. And on coming back last Friday morning, arriving back home at about after midnight, I then had to travel to Omaha, Nebraska, to give a keynote address at an event there. And in Chicago, the weather was extremely cold. I mean, it's like just these changes in weather sometimes are really traumatizing, because we had left Syracuse in t-shirts, feeling nice and warm and so on. And in fact, I had a little overcoat, a bit light, and I saw people looking at me as if to say, you know, where is this village woman coming from? It's warm, why are you wearing a light coat? But not even like that light coat was able to protect me from the cold and the wind in Chicago. So I ended up catching a cold that then had developed into a bronchial attack that, you know, but I was just hoping and praying that I would be able to come here tonight, and I feel much better after a series of injections to clear some fluid that was beginning to gather in my lungs. So I'm really delighted to be here. And it's a pleasure as well as a privilege, of course, to be asked to be reflecting on this topic here. On May Day, as we remember the importance of May Day and what that represents, and I'll come back onto that. But let me begin by saying that I'm going to narrow my topic a little bit so that I speak about the role of women in African liberation movement, and then look at the lessons thereafter. And the reason I'm focusing on women is that today, as we look at ourselves in the 21st century, we are still listening to discourses that are literally what is being minimized as a war on women, but that is precisely what it is. And this attack on women, as well as on workers, and of course on poor people, is something that we need to think seriously about. And within the continent, of Africa, this is specifically, critical. That if we don't reflect on women, we are going to miss a whole lot of discourses that should lead us then to understand why the world needs to come together around the problems that are facing us. So let me focus on the role of women in the liberation struggles, and then the lessons from those as we apply them to what we are experiencing today. I have asked Andy to pass around some maps there. And the first map I always like to give out to my classes. Some of you may have come across that map. But it actually surprises you at the huge size that the African continent is, and at how this tends to be ignored and missed in terms of the volume of population of people that we have, their size alone, and so forth. And if you look at that map, would you believe it? You can see that the continent of Africa could contain the United States of America, Argentina, India, Europe, New Zealand, China, and so forth, all in that space. So we are looking at expansive space here. We are looking at huge populations. I say this because sometimes when you talk with some people who have little knowledge of geography, you will hear them referring to Africa as a country. And this is a continent with now more than 52 countries, which is what that second map there, that is a little dated, represents, because it doesn't have some of the newer developments in terms of new republics here, but at least it gives you an idea of the countries we have there. The other thing about that second map is that it shows you the years when the various countries of Africa won their political independence. And in fact, I like to call it flag independence, because from the lessons that we are going to look at right now, that independence has not translated into gender emancipation. It has not translated into equitable distribution of resources and wealth. It has not translated into marginalization of so-called minority communities and so forth. It has not really translated into what that project of independence was supposed to do to benefit the majority of people. The map after that, that is not very clear and so on, is a little more recent and shows you a bit more. But you can have that and take it with you free of charge. I thought of charging about $5 and so on, then I decided against it and so on, because I used a free copy in the Department of African Americans. So let me begin by arguing that although the struggle for independence from colonialism in Africa, like elsewhere in the world, started from the moment that colonization was imposed. And I want to emphasize this, that any time a system of domination enters space, there is resistance immediately. So the struggles precede the actual historical concept that we have of the struggles as having started. Right from the beginning, there were structures and symbols of resistance among our people. And among these symbols and these individuals as well as groups and so on were women. And I'll try to name some of them. And this went on right to the final emancipation that we really had thought historically was going to be an impossibility, the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. This was a system that looked so formidable that it just didn't look like it would ever happen. So if we speak of liberation movements in a classical sense, then we can date them. But speaking as a concept, liberation started way from the moment that invasions came about and the nation started. The second thing I want to highlight is the issue of certain countries that won their independence through actual armed struggle. And we have two patterns in the independence struggle on the continent of Africa. Those that observe armed struggle and others that observe what is called passive resistance or struggle. But both forms of emancipation, both forms of liberation really cost a great deal, and women were very much involved in them. If we look at some of the classical cases that waged liberation, armed war for liberation, we can look at Kenya, 1952 to 1960, Algeria, 1954 to 1962, and you can look, if you look at the map, you see those places. Kenya is in East Africa, Algeria is on West Africa, Angola towards the center part going south and west of Africa, 61 to 75, Mozambique, 1962 to 75, Guinea-Bissau, 63 to 1974, Zimbabwe, 64 to 1979, and of course, South Africa, 1992. Now, I want to say then that in all these struggles, women were at the center of mobilization, the center of involvement, and they played a very, very key role in the liberation of Africa. And yet, as we look at the whole of this project, and we look at a country, one of the first really to be independent, Ghana, and we look at how many years have passed and so forth, we recognize in all these spaces what I'm calling unliberated zones for women, for workers, for poor people, ordinary people, and so forth. And this is the case not just on the continent of Africa, but globally. And we have to recognize, much as we want to talk about progress, about development, about achievement, and so forth, that within this larger, space that we are looking at, there are a lot of areas of what I call unliberated zones. So that I like to argue, and I know it upsets people in America when I say that right here, in North America, a place that is supposed to have done so well industrially, technologically, so on and so forth, we have unliberated zones that represent what people refer to as the, quote, third world. So we have third worlds within the first worlds. And these are some of the lessons I'm going to come back to in order to really discuss. When we speak generally and about progress, about what we have achieved and so forth, are we taking into account the whole collective society and its development in what we are defining as development? Again, if we are talking about development, are we considering that unless human beings as the biggest component that allow development to happen, are we taking into consideration that if human beings have not realized themselves fully at all levels of society, then however many roads we have, however many aeroplanes, however many arsenals that allow us to become a superpower, we have and so forth, really the achievement can be said to be highly questionable. So I do want us to come to some of these questions of self-search. But I want to take you now back into history in order to show how ordinary women contributed to the struggle for independence and liberation on the continent of Africa. I don't know how many of you have heard about a woman called Queen Anne Nzinga of the Matamba people in Angola. I referred to Angola again towards the west, towards going towards South Africa. And this woman was a leader within what I call a horizontal society. And in a horizontal society, we are talking about leaders who are actually put into power by people choosing them. These are their representatives. If we look at horizontal societies, then we are looking at kings and chiefs and so on, that represent very much more of a feudal organization. Here I am borrowing from Amilcar Cabral. And for those of you who don't know Amilcar Cabral, one of the greatest liberators from Guinea-Bissau, who has also theorized very, very clearly on issues of class and issues of social development, on issues of using culture for liberation, which this art gallery represents, need to read Amilcar Cabral, at least one book, Return to the Source. Because in that work, Return to the Source, he shows the absolute importance of ordinary people, the masses of people being engaged, not just being used for liberation processes, but being engaged to determine the direction of that a country takes, the policies that a country chooses, and so forth. And Amilcar Cabral has written a great deal about the use of culture and about the social organizations in Africa. And the good thing, or one thing that you can say was very important in what people call pre-colonial societies, which I call Zamani. I use Zamani to connote ancient societies or societies that existed way back from times immemorial. I don't like to use pre-colonial or post-colonial and so on, because colonialism then becomes the watershed by which we measure ourselves and history and so forth. So when I say Zamani societies, I mean societies that existed before these invasions and so on. So in Zamani societies, one thing we have to realize is that when people actually chose their leaders, those leaders became accountable to them. And in this case, Queen Anne Nzinga, in the 16th century, waged war against the Portuguese who were using that region for slavery. And in fact, she not only fought them and defeated them in a protracted war of about 30 years, but declared her territory free territory for any enslaved person, saying this is a free zone. Anybody who enters here enters free land to which they are entitled as a part of their space. Now, this is critical if we're talking about the 16th century, when there was no talk of Pan-Africanism, there was no talk of, networking globally and so on. But this woman was able to say, whoever comes in here as an enslaved person is in free territory and becomes a part of Angola's free territory and such. We are talking about, as I said, the 16th century. There are other examples, like in Ghana, for instance, and I see some people here from Ghana, Ya Asantewa, and the importance of the resistance that Ya Asantewa put up, especially as chiefs and some of the other leaders were beginning to cower under, British invasion. This was a lady with vision, with courage, who challenged the community and said that she didn't want to be a leader or queen of a cowardly nation that is going to sit down and let invaders come in. And this quality of leaders and leadership and the sense of self-sacrifice and what they have been able to do, some of them over history, is a lesson that I want us to come back to as we evaluate ourselves and talk about sometimes the abdication of responsibility, surrendering ourselves and giving ourselves to our so-called leaders. And I want to come back to that concept much later on. That the leader was one of the people in horizontal society. And if they didn't represent the people and were not a part of the people, then it became a major problem. In Zimbabwe, we have another very important case of a lady who was called Mbuya Nehanda. And Mbuya Nehanda was, again, a person who was just amazing. She was a spiritual leader of the Shona people in the central part of Zimbabwe. And at the time that she was facing British forces of occupation, she was already going towards eldership. But in that position as a spiritual and political leader, she organized the Shona people to rebel and use whatever tools were in their power to resist British invasion. And if we move then from the 18th, 19th century to come to the 20th century, we have other examples. In Kenya, we have an ordinary woman who was part of the peasantry, but who was a spiritual leader. If you look at Kenya, towards the coast of Kenya, that's where the Giriama people live. And this was a leader among the Giriama people. This lady was about 70 years old when British occupation at the coast was threatening not only to dislocate people in Giriama land and so forth, but literally setting up fires to houses and stock and livestock and so forth, where people rebelled and so forth. This woman organized a resistance that is unheard of, and her name was Mekatilili Wamenza. Mekatilili, M-E-K-A-T-I-L-I-L-I. So Me is one name, Katilili, and the last name is Menza, M-E-N-Z-A. Mekatilili Wamenza was a person, a woman who couldn't read or write, but she was a leader who was, of such amazing dimensions that we can arguably say that she was the first person to engage in guerrilla warfare against the British at the turn of the 20th century. And this was really completely unheard of, because these were the days when the British empire spoke of itself as the empire where the sun never sets. So people dared not, engage, the British Empire. But the other great thing about this woman is that when the British forces of occupation caught up with her, they deported her way up north, in the north of Kenya, like 500 miles or more. And in those days, of course, there were no roads, there were no flights there. That's where they put her in detention. But this woman was able to escape with her assistant and walk all the way from Western Kenya right down back to the coast again. And if you imagine how she was able to do that, we are saying that she passed through groups of people and societies with whom she didn't speak a common language, with whom she didn't share ethnicity or anything like that. But these people worked with her in order to hide her and in order to help her escape and go right back to the coast. Eventually, it is understood that the British buried her alive as punishment when they caught up with her. And it was through treachery by somebody who told on her. But the lesson here is major, that today, in 2012, we are talking of African countries that are torn by what term is called tribalism, ethnicity, divisions, and so forth. We are talking, in fact, of spaces in which vicious wars have broken down along ethnic lines. We are reminded that about not even more than 15 years ago, there was ethnic cleansing, or one of the highest cases of ethnic cleansing in Rwanda and Burundi. And we are asking, what are the lessons that we really are finding so difficult to learn from people who lived generations before us and people who were committed to the project of liberation that involved all other individuals collectively, rather than, a project in which you're talking about ethnicities, about particular leaders, so on and so forth. But this happened. In Nigeria, there were amazing stories of women and the liberation struggle that I could talk about. But the major ones that I want to refer ourselves to, what are known as the Aba Women's Riots in 1929 in southeastern Nigeria. I mean, this was a formidable rebellion. Women just literally got together and decided that they were going to bond, around not just national issues and so forth, but to argue that they were going to assume the center of history, because when it came to suffering and when it came to poverty and other forms of injustice, they argued they were most affected. These were ordinary market women, these were ordinary farmers and so on, and they organized a rebellion that riveted eastern Nigeria, and that sent, again, the British forces scattering around. And they said clearly, in these days, they said, women are the worst force possible that you can imagine when they organize themselves to rebel. There was commitment, there was persistence, and they were just so obstinate, nothing could move them. Some years later, in Yoruba land, there was a similar rebellion by Yoruba women. The famous 1947-48 rebellion of Abeokuta women. And for those of you who have not read Wole Soyinka's first autobiography entitled Ake, A-K-E, which is about the earlier years of his childhood, Ake, he talks about that because some of the women who were involved in there were the mother of, who is this, the Nigerian musician? Fela Kuti, and Wole Soyinka's aunt and so forth, who then passed on this spirit of rebellion and so forth to their sons and daughters and so forth. And what is unique about these rebellions is this passing on of the baton. That once the women led and were part of the movement, they didn't occupy spaces and then, kind of monopolize power. It was passed on to the community. Now, I don't want to idealize this. I'm just quoting citations in history that give us examples of where, leadership means that you are representing the collective and not just on a power trip on your own in order to become powerful. There are other instances and cases that we can, cite that, of course, show the opposite. If we move to South Africa, and you look and you go right back, in fact, from the beginnings of apartheid, the women were centrally involved in what was happening. You all, or many of you, know how we celebrate the famous Defiance campaign, the protest that women organized in protest of imposition of the past system under apartheid. And in fact, this was organized, of course, under the African National Congress. These were women of the African National Congress, but they were able to co-opt others and get cooperation and collaboration from other people. And this campaign under apartheid culminated in 1955 August with the 9 March to Pretoria, where the women went and burned up these passes that were being posed on people to carry around with them in order to be able to enter certain spaces in South Africa and so forth. And this is still historically commemorated today as National Women's Day in South Africa. And so it becomes very, very important for us to remember this. Again, you can go to latter dates when the struggle against apartheid heightened, and you have the Soweto children. And here again, I'm coming to center the youth and the importance of the youth and young people, because they too have been very involved in struggles for liberation on the continent of Africa. And they have not witnessed any power, they have not witnessed themselves being incorporated into the structures that result after independence and so on. And this is serious when we look at young people. And I want to begin revising some of the terminology that we use when we are talking about the youth and young people, talking about them as the future of our countries, the future of our nations. They are not the future, they are the now of our societies and our nations. After all, it is really their lives that have been mortgaged when we look at what is happening in terms of distribution of wealth and power and so forth. And therefore, this campaign that involved the youth now and then, some of them really young people who left school and classrooms and so forth in order to organize and protest against apartheid and so on, was very strongly supported by the mothers of Soweto, by women such as Winnie Mandela. I know recent history has really given her, a bad rap, but I want us to remember historically what this woman has contributed, including, in fact, had it not been for Winnie Mandela, there is a sense in which you can argue Nelson Mandela would have been forgotten on Robben Island. So as we critique, let us also embrace the historical contribution. So it was Winnie Mandela, it was Fatima Mir, Ellen Kuzwayo at that time, an elder again in her 70s and so forth, and other younger women and so forth who were very much a part of this movement. Now, I could go on and go to Zimbabwe, which has been my home until recently, where again, women, young and old, other than that first generation of Mbuya Nehanda, were very, very involved in the liberation struggle. But what happened after the flag was raised and the British or the Portuguese and so on left the ground? What happened was that women In fact, especially those of them who were involved in the liberation process as combatants, were actually kind of not just marginalized, but looked upon as untouchables when they returned from the war. The men were received as heroes of that history, but women were conceived as people who had shed blood, and therefore people who couldn't enter into marriages, and people who couldn't, become mothers, so on and so forth, immediately, there was this notion about who can possess power and who cannot possess, power. The stories that we have that redeem this situation are the stories of Mozambique and the stories of Guinea-Bissau. Mozambique, under the leadership of Eduardo Mondlane, who, by the way, I understand you have taught for a little while in Maxwell, and who brought discourse here that was very socialist and very radical, especially for those days and so forth. But under Eduardo Mondlane and under Samora Machel, there was a specific program to include women and the youth. In fact, these two leaders went beyond just including women to making them central to the liberation process. Samora Machel used to argue that the way that you can recognize whether a country is progressive or not is by measuring what kind of positions in society women occupy. And that this is a measure of how liberated a society is. And once you begin, marginalizing women, marginalizing youth, then he argued this liberation project failed. He used to say this women, the masses, and the youth are an integral part of the process of liberation. And they have to be not just included, but become a part of decision-making, a part of power sharing, so on and so forth. Now, I want to move to the lesson because we really need to enter this space in order to begin also coming closer home in terms of the lessons that I'm seeing here. What happened with the project of liberation in most of African countries? Number one, we assumed, and I want to say we because I want to assume collective responsibility of what we have done with historical projects of liberation. We assumed that winning the election and defeating the colonials, the British, the Portuguese, the French, and so forth, that we had won, that the project was complete. The job was done. The job had been completed. There was euphoria and celebration and drinking and feasting and so on. And this is lesson number one. We talk of heroes and heroines of history and struggle, but we are feasting and celebrating and remembering them and so forth all the time, and making huge, huge jamborees to celebrate what they have done and so forth. But a lot of the spaces that they fought to liberate are still unliberated today. So the question is, as we engage in these celebrations, we need to ask ourselves, what part have we played or are we playing in order to ensure that the liberated peace continues? Because if we are to assume that a revolution begins at a certain point and ends at a certain point, then definitely we are going to be in a lot of trouble. This is a work in progress. It continues and it never ends until injustices are completely wiped out of this world, out of the systems in which we engage. This is critical. Under this same lesson here, there was an assumption that the enemy was just the colonials. There was failure to identify the systems of domination and oppression as the major and central enemy. That sometimes didn't have to do with color, white, yellow, black, this or that, but a lot of the times because racism was a part of the invasion and colonial project, it was a part of it, we can't ignore it. But we forgot to recognize that it is the system that is central. And unless the system is dismantled and we are ready to create a new system, then we have failed. And this is the lesson from our sister Audre Lorde, who said, you cannot use master's tools, to, destroy his structure and so on, or to rebuild a new one. But under colonization, we assumed, oh, the white man is gone, the colonials are gone, we can continue. But what happened? And this is number two. We lost vigilance, and we actually surrendered ourselves to what I call, or some people have called, flag independence. We assumed that the African leaders who took over power, were the primary keepers of the project, for which ordinary women, as I have mentioned, youth, and a whole lot of people had struggled for. So we handed over power, as it were, and we handed over power to a petty bourgeois class, a class that sometimes can become very problematic in terms of consistency. I want here to distinguish that we cannot, of course, group the petty bourgeoisie or the elite in one group. There are progressive, there are moderates, there are liberals, and there are revolutionaries. We have to remember that. But by and large, ordinary people, especially the masses, assumed the educated elite are the ones who have the power and the authority to lead, and they surrendered their leadership to this. I want us to remind ourselves of what Frantz Fanon said in a very famous essay that is in a book of his called The Wretched of the Earth. And this essay is called Pitfalls of Nationalism. And the pitfalls of nationalism that he critiques and analyzes there has to do with how easily changeable this class of elitist leaders can be, how they can change course, how they can work towards their self-interest, how they can become individualistic because of the socialization of an ethos of individualism rather than looking at the collective. After all, we are looking at the products of the colonial classroom, and I am one of them. And you have to work consistently with a lot of vigilance to liberate yourself from this individualism and this centering of seeing you are the natural leaders. So that's the other issue that we need to talk about here. Where are the leaders from the working class? Where are the leaders from ordinary people? Why has it been assumed that education literally translates into the right to become a leader and to lead people? And we need to be humble enough as we are building our movements to keep asking ourselves this question. And this is not to say that the elites cannot lead, because we have a lot of progressive leaders, including presidents on the continent of Africa, like Cabral I have mentioned, Samora Machel I have mentioned, so on and so forth, who really have shown that they are able to see themselves as a part of the people. Number three, we have to remind ourselves that what the heads of state in Africa have become in terms of dictators, in terms of people who are so powerful that nobody can question them, nobody can even have a conversation with them, in terms of being so alienated from the masses and the people, is a part of our own making collectively. Why do I say this? I say this because we have built on the African continent a culture of worshiping leaders, a culture of silencing ourselves and censoring ourselves to the extent that we dare not criticize them, even when it is obvious that things are going wrong. And this is the other thing that people need to claim authority and power here, in this country and all over that. whatever we do, we must never let our leaders consider themselves as being above criticism, as being above debate, as being above the discourses that concern what is happening to us and so on. This abdication of leadership to heads of state that we create deities out of is a very major problem. And we are creating deities and gods and goddesses of people everywhere. Sometimes it is the academy. And we even go and listen sometimes to academicians speaking to us in language we don't understand. And the more they alienate us with their language and show us how powerful they are intellectually, and how above us they are, the more we fear them and respect them and hold them in awe and so forth. And this creation of gods and goddesses and deities really has got to stop. Because unless we stop that, what we are really doing is passing a vote of no confidence in ourselves. And this is not just an abuse of ourselves, but an abuse of that power of the collective group that I was showing that we need to bring in order to have the energy to move forward. The next point that I want to talk about is the betrayal by African independent nations of the working class and poor people. And the betrayal of working class started with the systems that we chose to adopt at independence. A lot of the unions and workers' organizations and so on who are fighting for a system that would see to the equitable distribution of wealth, that would see to the respect of workers and their labor, that would understand that a nation, as one Kenyan politician put it, a nation of 20 million beggars with just 3 or 4 millionaires or millionaires is not a nation that fought and sacrificed everything possible, understanding that they were investing in a collective future. I have witnessed in this country the degradation of workers and the working class to degrees that are really frightening. And this has got to do with the faith that we keep expressing in a system such as capitalism, neoliberalism, that has not been able to deliver for centuries. And we still want to argue that these systems will deliver and to show faith in them. And not only show faith in them, but take pride in them and even call them systems that create progress. And this is the progress I'm talking about, where you have third worlds within a first world. And you're wondering, what kind of progress are we talking about? This is the kind of progress where we have people who are troubled by drugs and drug addiction, who are troubled by violence and poverty, domestic violence and abuse. We are talking of a country where we have a prison industrial complex that really does not resemble any other in the world. And we need to ask ourselves, when we talk of progress, what are we talking about? When we talk of civilization, what are we talking about? And it is there. I just want to say that until that includes the majority of people, we are really headed nowhere. So, betrayal of the working class and poor people, the comfort that we assume that because we have a good job or because we are doing okay, it's all right, we are happy with the system. And the failure to understand that so long as other people are sitting outside these structures of comfort, we have not achieved anything. I talked about women and youth and their inclusion as part of this. I've been listening to the debates that have been going on, and some of the insults that I have heard being leveled at women in some of the discussions in your highest spaces of power and makers of law and so forth. And literally treating issues of women's health, women's welfare, women's choice and so forth, as if it's just a joke, and talking about them as if they cannot think for themselves and decide for themselves. And I'm saying, are we in the 21st century, or exactly where are we? Where are these dinosaurs? And where are they coming from? Some of them are Harvard educated, I hear, but I don't know what we are thinking about. And we need to raise our voices, against this bullying, because if we don't speak up today as it's happening to one group of people, it's going to happen to us. I've listened to discourses that are really not just hostile, but that are dangerous when we are talking about sexuality and differences in sexuality. I've listened to some statements that are so homophobic that I'm just saying, I really hope that guy does not have a gun or a grenade, because I am sure they will throw it on the next person that they assume is, a part of, the gay community or whatever. I'm listening to people talking about poverty and poor people as if it is their fault. That what's wrong with you? Make it happen. This is a world of dreams, and this is a world of self-realization. And so if you have not made it, you have yourself to blame. So we excuse the system, we excuse the injustices and so on, and we engage in what is called the art of blaming the victim. Nancy, where is this heartlessness coming from? And this is where I want to lead in terms of, lessons. And I want to say something that will probably be very unpopular and dangerous here. I want to argue that we need to rethink the socialist project. We need to rethink in terms of, systemic organization, to revisit the project of socialism. Because what this project is really talking about is that we need to look at how resources are shared and distributed and so forth, who participates in it, who makes decisions and so forth, what structures we have that don't just benefit a few at the expense of the majority, so on and so forth. That's all that this project is really talking about. And it needs to be talked about. It's becoming a dirty word. People are almost scared of mentioning it or, saying anything about it. But I just came from Tanzania, where the country has chosen neoliberalism. But the debates that were there 2 weeks ago when I received the Nyerere Award had to do with people revisiting the project of socialism, Ujamaa, that Mwalimu Julius Nyerere was talking about. Because they are saying that neoliberalism is just leading them into deeper debt, into poverty, into inequities and so forth. And they are not seeing any possibility of making it, anywhere. This brings me to the final, point, where I'm looking for networking and interlinkages between us as human beings who are opposed to injustices, as human beings who are opposed to systems that disadvantage others, that dehumanize others, and so forth. And I'm saying this: if we are looking at any economic system, I want us to remember that the major thing has to do with what Walter Rodney taught us in how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And he argued, and I agree with him fully, that human beings are the most precious resources in terms of creating a different system, a different world, imagining things, inventing things and so forth. If we don't liberate, human beings as the major human resources, there is very little else we can do. And I'm saying that if we are choosing systems, political systems, economic systems, we need to ask ourselves, how humanizing is this system? Because the reason that we want to change the world is presumably so that we too, as individuals and as a collective group, can also change so that we create a new world. If this does not happen, we are really lying to ourselves. And I say this, and I will say it again, that for me, therefore, as we look at points at which we can network, at which we can collaborate, we look at Peace Council, we look at Ghana Society of Central New York, we look at, NAACP, we need to find ourselves at the medium, at the very basic level. What we are saying is, we need to find that meeting point where our humanity becomes a common factor. And only in recognizing that moment and that place, when I look at you eye to eye, face to face, until we recognize that critical moment and seize upon it and intervene to make use of it, so that the battles that the Peace Council is running becomes also my concern. That the work that the United Women of Africa are doing also becomes our concern. The work that the Pan-African Community of Selfrealization becomes our concern. The work that progressive student groups on campus are doing becomes our concern. Unless we look at that common point where our DNA in terms of humanity is able to meet and recognize each other and embrace one another, we are not going to move very far. So the lessons of Africa, they are the lessons of America. The lessons that we are learning about Africa are the same lessons as the people in Britain are learning. That Margaret Thatcher's reign was not going to deliver, Britain anywhere. That currently, as we are talking about what constitutes nations and nationalities and so forth, and we begin looking at each other and saying, you come from Mexico, you come from Ireland, you come from wherever and so forth, we are failing to recognize that critical moment where we meet as human beings. And until we do that, divisions are going to continue and we are not going to make it anywhere. I want to wind up with reading a poem that I know that Andy and some others heard that because I read it at the open mic that happened a little while ago. But I would like us to finish with this poem, in terms of summarizing what I have been trying to say. The poem is in my second volume collection of poetry called My Mother's Poem and Other Songs. And it is called Plant a Tree. I had written the poem during a commemoration at Lemoyne College, where they were honoring Professor Wangari Maathai, the environmentalist Nobel Prize winner, who also has used that work in order to engage Kenyan people and the masses in other struggles. So this was a ceremony honoring her and other Kenyan freedom fighters, including myself. And she had asked me to write a poem in commemoration of this event. And it occurred to me that Lemoyne soil stood on the land of the Onondaga nation, Onondaga people. And as we were planting trees to remember liberations in Africa, we needed to also plant a tree right here to remember the need to liberate the unliberated zones that are right in our backyard. And so I wrote this poem as a demonstration of the connectedness of our struggles and as a demonstration that liberation did not just occur out there or is occurring here, it needs to be all over in the world. So it's called Plant a Tree. And I'm going to ask you to participate. When I point out to you, please say plant a tree.
Plant a tree.
Again?
Plant a tree.
And it's really an emphatic kind of statement. Poem composed for and recited at a tree dedication ceremony in honor of Professor Wangari Maathai and other women in the Kenyan people's struggle at Lemoyne College, June 24, 1992. On this abundant Lemoyne soil nurturing trees of unassailable knowledge, on this Onondaga native soil endowed birthright from immemorial dawn, on this bounteous Onondaga land trampled upon by Christopher Columbus 500 burdened years ago, we who refuse to stampede on humans, soil, or plant a tree.
Plant a tree.
A tree of resistance and struggle, a tree of justice and equality, a tree of dialogue and love, a tree so defiant of drought and plunder that no human-made disaster can shake it, a tree with roots anchored so deep that no living destruction can uproot it.
Plant a tree.
Side by side, you and I will water the seedling till our tree is full grown, till our tree is forested with thickets of branches stretching, reaching out south, north, east, west, holding the leaves to the sun, till in knowing rhythm they dance to the tune of the humming wind, till our tree is forested with thickets of branches stretching out, reaching out, beckoning to the birds of the air as they swim across the sky, inviting the passing travelers to build nests, make beds there, exhorting them to sing in high soprano songs of nature, entreating them to bathe in the wooing, streaming rays of the smiling sun. Shoulder to shoulder, you and I will water the tree of humanity till it is full grown, till its flowering stuns the world with loveliness, till natural beauty merges in fusion with human beauty, till no child cries tears of earth, tears of hunger, till all Onondaga children return from America's wild reservations, walking proud on Onondaga native land. Hand in hand, you and I will water the tree of sisterhood and brotherhood till the grown tree overwhelms the soil upon which division grows, and the grown tree will have a shade so encompassing no heat wave can touch it, a shade so embracing that unborn generations shall shelter there 500 unborn years to come. 500 unborn years to come, unborn generations shall shelter there, unmolested by ogres of imperialist greed. Unborn generations shall shelter there, playing in freedom, speaking in peace, singing in triumph, victorious songs from joyful, overflowing hearts. Unborn generations shall shelter there, whispering healing words from tongue to tongue, human voice to human voice. Unborn generations shall shelter there, basking under soothing calm, thriving under unconditional love, timelessly living, being, becoming. On this abundant, flaming soil, nurturing trees of unassailable life. On this Onondaga native soil, birthright from immemorial dawn, we who refuse to stampede on humans, soil, or plant a tree, recreate a history, releasing torrents of life-giving rain upon 500 tired years of the Christopher Columbus discovering drought. Thank you very much.
Some discussion, and while we get started with that, I'll pass around the sign-up sheet. The Peace Council is always, as I said earlier, looking for more folks to work with us, both as individuals and as Dr. Mugo talked about as organizations. We've collaborated on a number of events with PACNY and look forward to more of that. So feel free to sign that if you'd like. And also, the Peace Council is a low-budget operation that survives by people's donations. And I'll also pass around this little bowl. If you can contribute a little money, we'd welcome it. If you can't contribute any money, feel free to pass it on without any sense of guilt. We know that some people can contribute financially and others can't. So do you want to just go ahead and recognize?
Yes, in fact, make it a conversation. Comments and talk with one another. But if you do have a question, I will try to respond. Yes, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your reflection. I think I speak for all of us in terms of how grateful we are for your wisdom. One of the struggle that I'm involved in right now is kind of the immigration reform struggle. I was born in Senegal, and yet I've lived here most of my life. I consider myself in many ways more American. But in a lot of my discourse with U.S. citizens, I want to try to figure out ways to break down this concept of nationalism, to get people to move away from a sense of, you know, this nation is my space, and therefore I don't have to care about people in other nations. And I was wondering if you had any strategies in terms of getting people to see past, you know, the illusion, I think, of nationalism.
That's really such a critical question, and I believe that at the time that we were having interviews, I spoke to it in the sense of both on the African continent as well as in America, in fact, how important it is for us not to let geographical borders imprison us, and how, in fact, to learn to cross with ease, you know, these borders. Some of them artificially imposed, like with the continent of Africa, where, as you know, with the Berlin Conference in 1884-85, it was arbitrary. People chose, you know, what chunk, the best of land to take, and so forth. I have a friend who tells an incredible story where her aunt's house, you know, what a border passes through the bedroom of her aunt's house, so that one part of the house, the sitting room, is in some country, and the other one in some other part. And how ridiculous can you get, and so forth. So this notion of transcending borders, for me, is really becoming very, very important. And I think this is where, in fact, we can even use capitalist language and neoliberal language in order to do our own thing. They are talking of globalization. They are talking of this world as a village and so on. Okay, if economically we are going to turn it into a village, then let's turn it into a village in every possible way, you know, that we can. The question of self-definition here becomes, you know, a part of it. For some of us, any part of the world where we find ourselves is a site of struggle. It's a site of self-identification with people who are locally there and so on. So in a sense then, you know, the names of countries and so on cannot define us, and they cannot contain us, so on and so forth. But having said that, we know that we are operating within structures and systems that make these borders, you know, very definitive and very decisive and so forth. And you can only ask the progressive forces to continue fighting against these notions, because they only add to our division. Sometimes they become very alienating, where, as you say, you know, you have a person who was born in a country like America or Britain or Kenya or whatever, and so they identify, you know, with the place where they were, you know, they are, so on and so forth. But increasingly, you are sort of being bombarded with these notions of, you know, that you are, you know, the other and so on. So I think it's another side where, as progressive people, we really need, you know, to keep struggling and keep pushing and refuse, you know, to allow these to become larger prisons, because really, Alex Lagoma was right that systems of oppression create prisons around us all the time. Not just the physical prison, but prisons around our lives and in our communities, you know, whatever. And we just have to keep fighting against that kind of containment and keep liberating ourselves and creating more zones, you know, where we can meet in order to define new projects. Yes, please.
Would you say war is inevitable, and why or why not?
Absolutely not. In fact, I would say the opposite. That, you know, I think that war is, you know, a creation that historically sometimes has come to be defined as inevitable. Nations defining causes as why, you know, there has to be war and so forth. But war for me is a space where we engage in violence. It's a space where we are trying to prove that we are more powerful than others. And I have just spoken about, you know, combat and, you know, colonialism and under slavery and so forth, you know, where situations of war and so on created a condition where people had to fight back in order to liberate themselves and so on. But I think that even within those situations, if we look at today and historical movement that is teaching us that discussion and dialogue can lead to better options than war, I think we can argue that war, there is no way you can rationalize that war is inevitable. And we have seen situations where there was a possibility for war, but it was avoided through dialogue, through discourse, through discussion, and so on. So I don't know, what do you think? Why inevitable, first of all?
Well, I don't think it is, but I talk to a lot of people Americans, who believe it is, because they say it's human nature, or because we've always done it. I don't think they understand human nature as it is. They understand what our culture has taught us to think we are. But I would even like to argue that we didn't really need to have World War II, and that's not a very popular thought, particularly in America. But what do you do under those circumstances when you have a Hitler with a huge army and is going after everybody? How do you get to dialogue with a madman?
That so-called World War II, which some progressive historians call the Second Imperialist War, really was very much tied to fighting over territory. It was a war of occupation and a war of power and a war of who owns what and so forth, really. But there were aspects of that war, of course, that one can look at, where then it sort of became an attempt to eliminate, certain groups of people, certain peoples, and so forth. And in that situation, I really do believe that there are situations where one has to fight back. If you are under elimination, under complete threat, and so on, as was the case, under colonial occupation and so forth. But that since those days, and following how far we have moved in terms of making connections, in terms of linkages, in terms of platforms for discussion and so on, I think history has moved us beyond a point where we need to see war as a solution. And no war should be excused or should be excusable anyway. When you look at the destruction that is actually wrought by war and how much time it takes to even recover, and some aspects of life you can't even begin to recover in terms of devastating, the environment, people, infrastructure, and so on. Is it really worth it, And we have not given dialogue and discussion, much of a chance, and So no, I'm utterly opposed to war, at this point in human historical development. Yes, please. Okay.
Well, okay.
Let's have
along the lines of what she just, we were just discussing, what she just asked you, do you think that social media and the new technology that's available now will be part of preventing the possibility of us having wars to the extent that we've had in the past?
Depending on how it is used. Depending on how we use that, because technology can also be used very, very negatively. In the same way as journalism and writing and so forth, I can't remember who talked about throwing stones of words at people and bullets or whatever at people and so it depends on how it is used and to what end we direct it and so forth. We can't just generalize and talk about social media and so on as progressive or playing a progressive role, so on and so forth. So this is where I think the progressive forces have got to be very inventive and not be afraid of seizing, some of these spaces in order to use them, for the antithetical, project to projects of domination and destruction and suppression of, communication, dialogue, so on and so forth. What do you think? What do others of you think, especially those of you who are in technology and social media? Yes.
Well, considering current events, it seems like we're making some progress, but it's kind of vague to me to a certain extent about how it's going to affect us in the future. But it's somewhat encouraging because it seems to be a network of community that has gone global, and it seems like it has some potential.
On the positive side, this is what it has done, actually defied those borders, encouraged communication, literally torn, across any of the threats, around that would, and privileges about who gets a platform and who doesn't. The fact that we can all, or as many of us, have access as possible, but also to remind ourselves that a lot of poor people, a lot of people who don't also have, technology and so on are still, sort of out of it and cannot participate. So also to look at other means in which they too can be involved and if necessary become like vehicles that can then, also, sort of use what we have in order to communicate what they are not in a position to. I think we've got to be very inventive. I think we've got to, also be very daring and very courageous. I think we've got to seize these tools, what they are available to us and just run away with it. And this is what I would say, that to keep reminding ourselves that we have to define for what end, what is, the objective. Why are we doing it? Unless it's for progressive purposes of liberation, purposes of creating what I'm calling liberated spaces, it can also be very, very dangerous. Yeah.
I find it more encouraging than discouraging because I think more people with social media technology has a platform, the average person, whereas the people that normally have platforms, or the government, for instance, who are not representing the people. As you said, now everybody aren't privy to this technology, but the few that are becoming more conscious and having more to say. And so, for me, that's more encouraging than discouraging. Yes, it could be dangerous, and but I think overall it's more encouraging.
I agree with you, absolutely. Yes, there was someone at the back, and then sister yet.
I was wondering if you could help us understand some of the current events in your knowledge context. And you were talking about the nation state and how the borders are basically arbitrarily defined, so in a sense they're not legitimate. And there is this Pan-African movement which may be sort of resisting colonial encroachment and modern day imperialism. But like in Mali, there's this revolution and this group sort of split off. And sort of in Libya as well, there's been this sectarian dividing, and I guess I see that often that's a way that the imperialists use to weaken the power of a nation. But at the same time, some may say, well, we support this freedom movement, this group. Why should this group that spans Libya and Sudan and all these other countries, not have their own region? So I wonder if maybe you could just help us understand the current events in terms of your historical perspective.
Well, first of all, that you brought up a very important point that we need to remind ourselves the question of division and use of divide and rule as a tactic that has existed since days of slavery, days of colonialism, so on and so forth. And over centuries, really it has become socialized into us about dividing around issues of religion, issues of gender, issues of ethnicity, issues of class, this and that and the other. I hear an argument that says, well, we can't keep blaming, systems of oppression and domination for what has happened. But the psyche is a very, very critical site in terms of what it can internalize and reproduce, centuries, later. And I think that that is accompanied. But then, secondly, I also, this is what I was talking about, unless we see struggles as interconnected, and unless we look at those commonalities where we are saying, so long as our humanity or the humanity of any individual group is threatened, that struggle is my struggle, we are not going to arrive to a moment where we are really seriously achieving the project of liberation. And I'm saying this because today we may have Northern Sudan and Southern Sudan, but if we are not careful, even within Southern Sudan, you are then going to find, ethnicities beginning to arise and divisions beginning to creep in, on account of all these, differences that I'm talking about. And this is why I'm talking about vigilant all the time, So none of those spaces are secure or safe unless we can recognize this need for that collective struggle and waging them on the basis or the principle that any place where human life, human dignity is violated, I am there at the front line in order to do this. And what has happened in North Africa is very encouraging. The overthrow of the dictatorship is very encouraging, especially because it never looked as if it could ever happen. But already the people in those societies are beginning to learn, from the mistakes that they are making and have made, some of which we have discussed here tonight. And I think that eye of self-criticism all the time, and vigilance is the only thing that can really save us. Otherwise, I really don't believe that any place is secure, however liberated that place is, unless the revolution continues, as something that is ongoing. So I don't know, I can't help you, understand the situation because a lot of it is still unfolding. Nothing is really defined or clear, and the struggles are continuing. But really it is, for me, that's the only way I can look at it. In terms of what is happening in North Africa, and what is happening in the rest of the world and so on. Vigilance, vigilance, vigilance. Keep redefining those spaces as human spaces and not spaces that belong to this group, to the south or to the north, or linguistically to this or the other. Otherwise we fall into the same trap. And addressing the systems that we are creating, because the big mistake is, okay, we have, a liberation process, or we even have a revolution, but what do we create in its place? And I think what has gone wrong with a lot of these issues is that we have not had a project planned ahead that will replace, the system and institutions we are talking about. And it's not easy, and you cannot do it overnight. But it is something that needs to be a part of the agenda. Otherwise, just taking up and continuing from there, we are not going to be able to societies whatsoever.
So just to clarify, you think that the intervention in Libya has helped the situation there, and you predict that in the future the society will be more like
I wasn't
democracy?
addressing Libya specifically, because I was addressing just the general issue and so on, because once we come to each country, then it becomes this notion of people liberating another nation, first of all, for me, is really just something very arrogant and something that is completely unacceptable, because those people who call themselves liberators have got their own agenda. And we've got to be very, very clear. The intervention of the United States in Libya had a clear agenda in terms of what the United States wanted. But at the same time, I know that at the time, because of what was happening and loss of life and so forth, you were saying you need to have an intervention. I don't believe in interventions when interventions are being viewed as processes of liberating others. People go in and work, in solidarity with the forces that are working towards their own liberation. Then that is understandable. I didn't see it happening in Libya. It was under the guise of NATO going in and conducting the bombings. And here I'm not excusing Gaddafi or anything like that, but I'm saying that whatever he did or had done did not warrant another invasion by mightier powers in order to go and deal with the situation. And what has it done? It has created even more chaos now, even more division, even more problems and so forth. This is where I really do believe seriously that this impatience about going and interfering and entering space to liberate, instead of giving discussion and debate and dialogue, time, is very troubling. The third troubling factor with NATO and the way that NATO intervened in Egypt is that it completely disregarded the role of the African Union and any ideas or any participation that the African Union would have had. And they argued, if they were being very slow, it was taking too long and so on. But for me, these are really just excuses. Because the same thing had happened in Rwanda, and it took forever to intervene when there was a clear case of genocide taking place. So the question for me is, when do you choose where to intervene and where not to intervene? I mean, this for me becomes the major issue. So I'm sort of very, very divided in my thinking here, but one thing I'm clear about is that the nice invasions coming from NATO or from the US, I don't trust them. And I don't trust them because historically I have no reason to trust that it had anything to do other than their own agenda. So you may want to disagree with this.
Well, let's take one more question and then we'll, people can stay and continue the conversation informally.
Okay.
Aside from what you said, I'm of the opinion that war is inevitable because it was brought onto us. It wasn't anything that we started. Nonetheless, my question is, the language seems to be very, very careful, very scrupulous when it comes down to the discussions of, socialism, liberation, and things like that. That's understandable. But which dynamics do you think are more advanced, whether it's on this continent, the African continent, or anywhere in the world, that's more deserving of attention or support than all the rest of it?
Well, it would depend on your definition of advanced. What do you mean by
like Vietnam. Vietnam during the 60s.
Eyes?
During the 60s, Vietnam was very advanced insofar as the involvement or the crisis of a world war, developing into a world war. And there seems to be a war on every continent now. But it seems to be that some are more advanced than others. And I noticed that Northern Africa, or the so-called Middle East, seems to be divorced from the rest of the continents, only because of certain imperialist attentions that are imposed upon them. Nonetheless, that's what I meant. I meant which struggles seem to be more advanced or more deserving of support at this particular time, whether it's on Africa or here.
Well, I really, I'm not sure that, first of all, that I agree with the basis of that question, because who is deciding, who is making the decision to determine which is more advanced or which is not more advanced? You see, this becomes an issue. From whose perspective are we defining, which is worth supporting, what is not worth supporting? But generally, to answer your question, I think that any revolution or any movement for self-liberation that is being waged by the collective group of people, especially coming from the masses, and this has happened in Northern Africa and so forth, that kind of situation really deserves our attention and any solidarity that can be given, but not our entering the space to be part of the contestation also. For instance, during the Black Power movement here, some of us contributed to what was happening because in that project one could see, the way the system was being challenged and what was going on during the liberation struggles in Africa. Many of us contributed and were part of it because we could see that there was an agenda for liberation from domination and so forth. So it depends on what the struggle is about. And if a struggle is really seriously seeking to empower people, it's seeking to obliterate injustices in terms of economic, participation, political participation, so on and so forth. Then we should give it solidarity, but not go there to lead it or to place it above the others and so forth. So in other words, we cannot determine, only the people themselves can really determine the authenticity of their revolution, of their struggles. And if their goals and our objectives meet, if there is that collision, as I'm saying, not collision, but that meeting point between how we define ourselves as human beings, then we need to enter there and give solidarity in every way possible, but not to see the struggle. That would be my general response. I think I want to give Sister Daya a chance because her hand was up for a long, long time, just very quickly.
Thank you so much for the beautiful and excellent lecture. My question is, how can Africa be liberated if, economically wise, we still have to depend on IMF or World Bank? And most of the leaders, I understand that we have bad leaders, and most of the leaders, they've been brought in power from the influence of those economic group, IMF or World Bank. And do you have a vision for a united African state? Maybe that can solve some of our problems. If we have a united African state, we can become more powerful and not to have to rely on both IMF or World Bank.
Well, in fact, you have sort of answered the question indirectly, in that without economic liberation, I really don't see that we can speak of liberation at all. That's why I was talking about, uprooting the systems that create the injustices that we are dealing with. And a lot of the times, the power of those systems comes from the economy. Who owns what? Who controls what is going on where? And therefore, for me, I think that's the other lesson, in fact, that I tried to talk about, to emphasize that. We emphasize flag independence and the exit of, a certain color or rulers or so, that we forgot that the systems that we had put in place were intact. And those systems really are economically controlled. So this is why I'm really, really emphasizing that struggles by workers, by poor people, struggles on justice and equity, ending war, ending in environmental injustice and so on, that these address the root causes, in fact, that define, these the oppressions that are creating the inequities. So secure economic liberation is primary, and it is critical. Leaders who were good leaders talked about it. I spoke of Cabral, I spoke of Nyerere, and you can name Nkrumah very much at the beginning of the reign and so forth. So that yes, this is absolutely essential. In terms of unity, I'm arguing that I think it is an ongoing project. It cannot just be done overnight. But my argument is that we are not trying enough. We are looking more at points of differences rather than commonality or areas where we can begin running together. But I also do think that I believe in the kind of Pan-Africanism that has an international component that understands that with the solidarity of people who have faced same oppressions in terms of color, in terms of economic injustice, political participation, and so on and so forth, that we also need to recognize interrelated struggles as international, because as we know, even in terms of Pan-Africanism, you find black people all over the world, and so forth, so that the attempt at the continental level, at the global level, and so forth, seems to be the thrust that is also recognizing the connectedness of the struggles that I was talking about. And unless we do that, I don't think Pan-Africanism will also realize itself, because the issues that Pan-Africanism is dealing with that are very specific, relating, at the cultural level and so forth, or at the level of this, are given people are also the same that then, affect others. So it is the particularity or that site that we are looking at, that that site has to expand itself by linkages and networking. I think it will take a long, long time. It cannot be overnight. And I see areas in which we have succeeded and will continue to succeed in this regard.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Mugo. Want to encourage you, there's questions about social media within the next day or so. This whole talk will be available on YouTube, so share that with your friends. The Peace Council has a YouTube channel, so you can look that up. Related to solidarity, tonight at the same time we were meeting here, there were some people who were arrested at Hancock Airfield for protesting the drones, which are terrorizing people around the globe. That process will continue to resist the presence of these weapons right here in our community, and support is welcome for that. And we also, a major Peace Council project called Neighbors of the Onondaga Nation seeks to take the message of solidarity that Dr. Mugo talked about and apply it right here across our international border, which is just south of Syracuse, between our territory and the sovereign Onondaga Nation. So again, welcome you to connect with the Peace Council's work. There's, I think, some coffee still over there and tea and lots of sweets, so help yourselves. And Nick, you want to say something?
Yeah, if anyone wants to see the drone march, show it to you right over here on the computer.
Okay.
We got the video here.
So thank you for coming together. Thank you. That just doesn't let us sit back and recover on this.